Alex knew Julian was avoiding him, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. At first, he thought maybe it was temporary, that Julian just needed space to sort himself out. But days passed, then a week, then nearly two, and the silence between them stretched wider, more suffocating. Julian barely spoke to him at home, barely looked at him. When their parents were around, he acted normal, talked about school, laughed at their father's jokes, but the second they were alone, that easy, practiced mask vanished. Julian was running, and Alex hated him for it. Worse, he hated himself for caring. He tried to act like it didn't bother him, went out more, met up with old friends he hadn't seen in months, even flirted with a guy at a bar just to prove, to who exactly, that Julian wasn't in his head. But when the guy leaned in, close enough to kiss, all Alex could think about was Julian's mouth, Julian's hands, Julian's lips against his, warm and hesitant and real in a way nothing else had ever been. So he pulled away, left the bar, walked home in the freezing night air, trying to convince himself it wasn't a mistake to feel disappointed. The first time Julian acknowledged him in over a week, it was during dinner. Their parents had just left for a weekend trip, giving them the house to themselves. Again, and the tension was unbearable. Julian, fork scraping against his plate, finally looked at him. "Can you pass the salt?" Alex clenched his jaw, shoved the salt shaker across the table a little too hard, and watched Julian flinch when it nearly tipped over. That was it. That was all Julian gave him. Alex's patience snapped. Later that night, he found Julian in the living room, flipping through channels like he actually cared what was on. Alex stood in the doorway, arms crossed, waiting for Julian to acknowledge him. He didn't, so Alex forced it. "You're really going to keep pretending?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the low hum of the television. Julian stiffened, but his face stayed neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about." Alex scoffed. "Oh, come on. Don't do that." Julian exhaled, rubbing his temple like this conversation was an inconvenience. "Alex, just drop it." "No." Alex stepped closer, heat rising in his chest. "You kissed me, Julian. You. And now you're acting like it never happened." Julian's jaw tightened. "I told you it was a mistake." Alex laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Right? A mistake. Just something you tripped and fell into, huh?" Julian stood abruptly, the remote dropping onto the couch. "What do you want me to say?" His voice was low, tense. "I want you to stop lying," Alex shot back. "To yourself. To me." Julian clenched his fists at his sides. "I'm not lying." "Then look me in the eye and tell me you didn't feel anything." Julian swallowed hard. His gaze flickered, just for a second. Hesitation. And that single moment of uncertainty was enough. Alex stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating off Julian's skin. Close enough that he knew, if he reached out, Julian wouldn't move away. "You want to tell me it was a mistake?" Alex said, voice quieter now, almost a dare. "Fine. Say it, but make it convincing." Julian's breathing was uneven. His fingers twitched like he wanted to reach for something. Alex, maybe, but stopped himself. Alex watched him struggle, watched his throat bob, his lips part, his body go rigid with conflict. And then, finally, Julian exhaled shakily and said, "I can't do this." It wasn't an answer. It wasn't denial. It was fear. Alex stared at him, the weight of those words settling between them like a barrier. Then he took a slow step back, nodding to himself, jaw tight. "Yeah," he murmured, more to himself than Julian. "That's what I thought." He turned and walked away, leaving Julian standing in the dim light of the living room, fists clenched, breathing uneven. That night, Alex lay awake in his bed, staring at the ceiling. Julian was scared. He knew that now. But fear wasn't an excuse. And if Julian didn't figure that out soon, Alex wasn't sure he'd be able to wait for him to. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was nearly 2 a.m., and Alex hadn't been able to sleep. Not after that conversation. Not after seeing that look on Julian's face, the one caught between fear and something dangerously close to want. So he found himself in the kitchen, sipping a glass of water, staring at nothing, trying to will himself into exhaustion. The sound of footsteps made him tense. Julian appeared in the doorway, shirt rumpled, eyes heavy-lidded like he hadn't slept either. He hesitated before stepping in, as if debating whether to turn back. But then he crossed the kitchen and wordlessly pulled a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet above the fridge. Alex arched a brow. Seriously? Julian ignored him, twisting off the cap and taking a slow sip straight from the bottle. His expression didn't change as the alcohol burned down his throat. He took another, then finally glanced at Alex, as if realizing he was still there. Alex sighed, setting down his glass. So this is your solution? Getting drunk so you don't have to think? Julian exhaled a short laugh, but it held no humor. Thinking hasn't really been working out for me lately. Alex studied him, the tension in his shoulders, the slight shake in his fingers before he curled them around the bottle. Julian was unraveling, and for once, he wasn't hiding it well. You want to talk about it? Alex asked, even though he already knew the answer. Julian tilted his head, smirking faintly. Do I look like I want to talk? No, he didn't. He looked like he wanted to forget. Alex leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. Fine, don't talk. But don't pretend this is helping, either. Julian exhaled, running a hand through his hair. His gaze flickered toward Alex, holding it just a little too long before he looked away. He took another sip, slower this time. Alex didn't know what made him say it. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe it was the fact that he knew Julian wasn't here just because he needed a drink. Is it me? Alex asked quietly. Julian stilled. Alex swallowed, pulse quickening. Is that why you're like this? For a long moment, Julian didn't move. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Then, finally, Julian let out a breath. I don't know. His voice was quiet, raw. He turned the bottle in his hands, watching the liquid swirl. I don't know what the hell's wrong with me. Alex's chest tightened. There's nothing wrong with you. Julian scoffed, shaking his head. Then why does it feel like there is? Alex had no answer for that. The silence stretched between them, long and heavy. Julian's gaze flickered toward him again, hesitant, searching, and then, slowly, he set the bottle down on the counter. Alex felt it before it happened. The shift, the inevitability. Julian stepped closer, close enough that Alex could feel the warmth of his body, close enough that every breath between them felt too much. Julian, Alex said, warning in his voice. But Julian just shook his head. Don't. A whisper. A plea. And then he was there, pressing forward, not hesitating this time, his lips brushing against Alex's in a way that felt less like a kiss and more like a confession. Alex inhaled sharply, his body betraying him, his fingers curling into Julian's shirt before he could think better of it. But then, just as quickly as it started, Julian pulled back, eyes wide, breath unsteady. Shit, Julian muttered. He took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head like he was trying to shake off a dream. I can't. Alex clenched his fists, forcing himself to steady his own breathing. He should have known. He should have expected this. Don't, Alex said, voice tight. Don't you dare do this again. Julian looked at him, something breaking behind his eyes. I'm sorry. And then he turned and left. Alex didn't stop him. He just stood there, heart pounding, knowing this wasn't over. Not even close. Julian was drowning. The morning after the kiss, the second kiss, he woke up feeling like his own skin didn't fit right. Like he had been shoved into a life that no longer belonged to him. His head throbbed, partly from the whiskey, mostly from the thoughts circling like vultures in his brain. It had happened again. And this time, he couldn't even lie to himself. Couldn't call a mistake when he had wanted it, when he had made the choice to close the space between them. So he did what he did best. He ran. He spent the next few days avoiding home as much as possible, avoiding Alex. When being out wasn't an option, he made sure to stay holed up in his room, headphones on, pretending not to hear when Alex knocked or hovered outside his door like he was waiting for Julian to say something. He didn't, because he didn't have anything to say. At least, nothing Alex would want to hear. Julian's girlfriend noticed the shift almost immediately. Hey, she murmured one afternoon, her fingers brushing his wrist as they sat together on her couch. You've been quiet lately. He forced a smile. Just tired. She tilted her head, studying him. You sure that's all it is? He nodded, lied, kissed her to prove a point, though whether to her or to himself, he wasn't sure. But even as she melted into him, even as her hands tangled in his hair, it wasn't the same. Because the whole time, his mind was somewhere else, with someone else. And the worst part? He knew she could tell. Alex wasn't stupid. Julian's sudden overcorrection, the way he paraded around with his girlfriend more than usual, posting pictures, making sure Alex saw them, was too obvious. Too forced. It was pathetic, really, and it pissed Alex off. He hadn't confronted him yet, hadn't said a word since that night in the kitchen. But the silence was heavy, crackling with all the things neither of them wanted to be the first to say. Alex wasn't going to beg for honesty. Not anymore. If Julian wanted to keep lying to himself, fine. But Alex wasn't going to stand there and watch him self-destruct. Which was why, when he came home one evening to find Julian's girlfriend standing on the front porch, arms crossed, expression tight, he wasn't surprised. She had figured it out. I just want to know what's going on. Her voice was measured, but there was an edge to it, something fragile beneath the surface. Alex leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I think you already do. She exhaled sharply, like she had been holding her breath. I need you to say it. Alex studied her, the way her fingers gripped her own arms, the way she wasn't asking because she didn't know, but because she needed confirmation, because she was hoping she was wrong. Alex had no reason to lie. Not for Julian. Not anymore. He's lying to you, Alex said simply. Her breath hitched. There it was. The truth she had been afraid of. She looked away, jaw tight. It's you, isn't it? Alex didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence was enough. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to meet his gaze again. I don't get it. He says he loves me. Alex sighed. Maybe he does. Then, after a beat, but not like that. She flinched, like he had physically struck her. And maybe, in a way, he had. For a moment, she just stood there, breathing through whatever storm was raging inside her. Then, finally she straightened. I deserve better than this, she whispered. And Alex, despite everything, agreed. She turned and walked away without another word. Alex didn't stop her, because maybe now, Julian wouldn't be able to run anymore. Julian knew something was wrong the moment he stepped onto the porch. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, at this time of day, Alex would have the TV on, or music playing in his room, or he'd be in the kitchen making something he'd offer Julian, even if Julian never took it. But now, nothing. Then he saw it. The faint glow of light from Alex's room, the barely open door, the shape of Alex sitting on the edge of his bed, head bowed, waiting. Julian's stomach twisted. He didn't have to ask. He already knew. Still, he stepped inside, pushing the door open just enough to lean against the frame. His voice came out rough, hesitant. She came by, didn't she? Alex finally looked up. His expression was unreadable. Yeah. Julian exhaled slowly, dragging a hand down his face. What did she say? Alex tilted his head, studying him, testing him. Then he said, evenly, she asked if it was you. Julian's breath hitched. And? I didn't lie to her. Silence. Julian swayed, slightly where he stood, fingers twitching at his sides. He had spent so much time trying to keep everything contained, to hold onto some version of normalcy he wasn't even sure he wanted anymore. And now there was nothing left to hold on to. She left, Alex continued, voice calm. Said she deserved better. She does, Julian murmured. Alex nodded, as if Julian had just passed some unspoken test. So what now? Julian swallowed. I don't know. That's not good enough, Alex said, sharper this time. Not anymore. Julian flinched. He wasn't used to Alex being the one with the upper hand, but he deserved to be angry. Julian had spent weeks pushing and pulling, running and stopping, never once letting himself choose. Alex was done waiting. And Julian was tired. Tired of running. Tired of pretending. Tired of losing Alex piece by piece, just because he was too much of a coward to accept what was in front of him. So he forced himself to move. One step, then another, until he was standing right in front of Alex, looking at him without hesitation for the first time. I don't want to lose you, Julian admitted, voice raw. Alex's jaw tightened. Then stop pushing me away. Julian inhaled shakily. Then, before he could think better of it, before he could talk himself out of it, he reached for Alex's hand. Alex didn't pull away, didn't move at all, just watched him waiting. And Julian finally let himself stop running.